Hello students, today I am going to talk to you about the administration of the Palas and the Pratiharas. In the opinion of historian Brajodulal Chattopadhyay, the state as a political entity involves the analysis of its nature, its organization, and its distribution of power. Not only that, in a state society where the contours of inequality is very sharp, the relations of power encompass the relations at other levels in some form or other. The imperial rulers till the time of Harshavardhana made an active effort to stall the trends of fragmentation and disintegration, which they considered to be very disastrous for an ideal imperial order. From this perspective, one can examine the status of the upcoming regional powers in early medieval India and also look into their administrative structure. In fact, Professor Chattopadhyay further argues that in no form of state system, however centralized, there can be a single focus or a single level of power. Now, coming to another historian who has dealt with the state system of early medieval period in India is Hermann Kulke. Kulke thinks that the imperial kingdoms represented the third and the final stage in the development of Hindu states before the coming of the Islamic states in India. Among such imperial kingdoms, Kulke specially mentions the kingdom of the Cholas, the Rashtrakutas, the Chalukyas of Kollani, and the Palas. Here we find from his analysis that apart from the regional hegemony established by these imperial kingdoms, there was also another interesting feature, and that feature was the charismatic image of certain particular rulers, which was specially significant for the policy of the state as well as for the subjects who were ruled over by these imperial kingdoms. Another thing is that all of these powers, they extended several times than the original kingdom, than the size of their original kingdom through successful conquests. Such empires thus emerge from continuous process of integration of the state system with successful collaboration with the local centers of power. The administration of the Palas and the Pratiharas can be studied and analyzed from these two perspectives, that is, from the perspective of historian Brajodulal Chattopadhyay and that of Hermann Kulke. Coming to the administration of the Palas, the administrative competence of the Palas paved the way for their prolonged rule, which they established over a large area of eastern India. For nearly 4 centuries, the Palas established their supremacy over Bengal, Bihar, Assam, and the adjoining areas. Now, within this administrative system, first I'll talk to you about the structure of kingship. Kingship was hereditary in the Pala administrative system, and the form of government was obviously monarchical. The king was at the helm of power, adorned with titles like Parameshwar, Parambhattaraka, and Maharajadhiraja. Not only that, it was quite a common practice of contemporary society that a divine status was attached to the position of the king in order to enhance his image, to glorify his image in the eyes of his subjects. Although theoretically the king was the supreme head of the state, being the administrative head, the head of judiciary, head of the army, the treasury, and so on, but in reality there were certain limitations on his power. That these limitations came from two aspects: the presence of the ministers and the presence of the feudatories or the shamantos. The ministers during the Pala rule, they all held hereditary offices, As a result of this, over the years, some of the families of these ministers became very powerful and they exercised quite a lot of influence over the ruling monarch. Now coming to the ministers, the Palas inherited the tradition of hereditary ministry from the imperial Guptas. Two great ministerial families can be identified in the Pala records. These two families, in fact, maintained their own records and documentation. Badal pillar inscription refers to Gorgo, a Brahmin by caste, who was the founder of this ministerial family, and this lineage continued from Dharmapala to Narayanpala, that is almost for 5 generations. Gorgo's descendants continued to support and help the Pala rulers from Devapala till Narayanapala. Specifically, I should like to mention one of Gorgo's descendants, Gaurava Mishra, who was the composer of the Badal pillar inscription, and he was also a minister of Narayanpala. Grants referred to the names of officers who were connected with the administrative system. The term Mahakartakrika appears in the Munger copper plate of Devapala and the Bhagalpur copper plate grant of Narayanpala. This term indicated the presence of a very high-ranking official who was perhaps in charge of the work and building and took care of the construction of roads, buildings, embankment, and reservoirs. There is mention of 4 categories of ambassadors and messengers in the Pala records. These are, number 1, Duta. He was the highest in rank and represented the sovereign in the foreign courts. Then came the Khola. He was an envoy. The third position was that of Gama Gamika. He was the messenger from the central court to the provinces and the districts. The fourth in the rank was Abittara Mana. He was the carrier of urgent messages. Over and above, there was the presence of a special post which is known by the name of Duto Praisanika, or the officer in charge of all the messengers. The Pala monarchs maintained friendly relationships with their neighbors. Beyond the borders, the Pala Empire, especially under Devapala, experienced diplomatic relationship with Indonesia. Balaputra Deva of Subarnadipa, a famous king of the Shailendra dynasty, he made an appeal to Devapala for the grant of 4 villages for the maintenance of the Buddhist monasteries. The Dutaka of this royal grant, Balavarman, was a provincial governor under Devapala and a close associate of the Pala king. The incident illustrates the fact that during the transaction of 2 independent monarchs, an important official familiar with the court etiquettes and court formalities had a major role to play. Therefore, in the context of internal administration as well as in the area of foreign relationships, the officials under the Pala administration, they contributed considerably. Among the important ministers, we find quite a long list, like Shochibo, equivalent to a minister or a very high-ranking official appointed by the king. Then came the Raj Amatto, an official who was again very close to the monarch. Mahadandonayako. there is a difference of view in the Pala records regarding the duties and the power of this post. On one hand, the Dandonayako is regarded as the highest judicial officer. Again, in some other records, he is shown as the head of the army or the head of the police department. After this came the Maha Kakshopataliko, the officer in charge of income, expenditure and accounts. He was also responsible for maintaining the government documents and records. Maha Pratiharo, officer in charge of security of the palace or the security of the border. Sandhi Bigrohiko, he was the minister in charge of war and peace. Then Maha Sandhi Bigrohiko, the highest minister in charge of war and peace. Maha Senapati, the highest military general. Maha Samontadhipati, the official in charge of the Samantos. Baladhyaksha, head of the royal infantry. Then Maha Kartakratika, the designation, which is of an important official whose duties and functions are not very clearly mentioned, and as I have earlier mentioned, he was probably connected with the Department of Works and Buildings. Thus, the administrative structure of the Palas were quite elaborate, consisting of a variety of ministers and officials who ably assisted the monarch. Now coming to the structure of the provincial administration of the Palas. The first thing which has to be mentioned is the Bhukti. Bhukti was the largest territorial division of the Palo kingdom. The Palo kings extended their empire up to Kanaujo, and it appears that Tiro Bhukti in Bihar and Srinagar Bhukti in Bihar were directly administered by the Palo monarchs. Pundro Bardhano Bhukti in Bengal was perhaps the largest administrative unit of the Pala kingdom. Pragjyotisha of Assam also had the status of a Bhukti under the Palas. The governors of the Bhuktis were known as Uparikas, and in some records the term Bhuktipati is also mentioned. Just below the Bhuktis came the Mandalas and the Vishayas. Bhuktis were divided into the Mandalas and the Vishayas. There are contradictory versions in the Pala records regarding the fact as to which were the lower unit, the Mandala or the Vishaya. In general, it appears that the majority of the Mandalas were subdivided into Vishayas. The smaller Mandalas were divided into Khandalas or Bithis. This was again a separate division. The headquarters of such districts were in the towns like Pundro Bardhana and Koti Varsha. The governors of the Mandalas were known as the Mandaliks, and that of the Vishayas were known as Vishayapatis. If Bhuktis were considered as provinces, then the Mandalas were districts, and the Vishayas enjoyed a little lower position than the districts as administrative units. Khalimpur inscriptions provide information regarding the administration of the Vishayas. In this inscription, we come across the names of several posts such as the Gramika, Gramapati, Dashogramika, Mahattaro and Jeshto Kayasto. All these posts appear to have assisted the Vishayapatis in the work of administration, and so they were known as or designated as Vishaya Babohariko. The head of the Vishaya was perhaps assisted by the Jeshto Kayasto, who sometimes worked as an accountant and sometimes assisted the Vishayapati in running the administration of the Vishaya. Position of Dashogramika indicated that he enjoyed a higher position than the village headman or the Gramika, and the word Dasha indicates that he was in charge of at least 10 village headmen. Again, another inscription of Dharmapalo mentioned Mahattaro and Maha Mahattaros, who also held important administrative positions in the locality. Now coming to the income of the state. sources of revenue can be classified under such heads as regular taxes, occasional taxes and exactions, fines, income from government properties, and tribute from feudatories, and so on. The agriculture was the main source of income, and regular taxes came from that source. Some of the regular taxes were as follows: the bhaga, the bhoga, the kara, hiranna, uparikara, and chaurodharano, among others, were important. Bhago referred to the revenues paid in kind or the usual grain share of the king. In the Khalimpur copper plate, an officer is mentioned by the name of Shashtadhikrita, who is mentioned to be in charge of the collection of 1/6 of the produce or the royal grain share. Bhoga was the periodical tax levied on the villagers where they were supposed to supply flowers, fruits, firewood, etc. to the royal house. Karo was a property tax levied periodically. Hiranno was a special type of tax levied on special type of crops. Uparikara was collected from temporary tenants. Chaurodharano perhaps meant a tax which was levied for police protection. Occasional taxes included Chatto Bhatto Probesho, that is the land grant which should not be entered by the Chattos and the Bhattos, that is the irregular and the regular military and police forces. Pindaka was a tax levied on the entire village. The fines were mainly collected from the judicial sources. Income from the government properties included the rights of the state on land and water. And finally, there was the tribute which the feudatories or the shamantas paid to the imperial lord. There was a considerable income of the Palas also from the commercial sources, as the Palas shared active trade relations with Southeast Asia. Now, coming to the expenditure of the state, there is no specific record regarding the expenditure of the Palo kingdom. However, one can assume that lots of funds were spent on the maintenance of the royal household and the royal court, as well as the maintenance of a permanent army. Not only that, there were gifts and grants to the Brahmins and different religious institutions. Educational and religious establishments and other public works associated with the Pala period also cost the treasury. Coming to the army organization of the Palas, the Nalanda copperplate inscription of Dharmapalo referred to a 5-winged army of the Palas, including elephants, cavalry, infantry, navy, and chariots. The military department of the Palo was in charge of the Mahashenapati and the Shenapati. The Mahashenapati also was responsible as a minister. Besides, there was the post of the Nabadhaksha, who was in charge of the navy, the Mahabhubopati, or officer in charge of arrays, Prantopalo, or the officer in charge of frontier fortresses, Kottapalo, the officer in charge of forts, Mahashamanto, the head of the Shamantos, and so on. A class of military officials were also known as Odhakshas, who took care of the elephants, horses, mules, cows, buffaloes, goats, and sheep. However, there is no mention of any officer in charge of the chariots. The army had a large contingent of elephants. The cavalry was also very powerful, as the Palas constantly fought with the Pratiharas, who were very strong in their cavalry. So the Palas also maintained the cavalry, and the horses were purchased from abroad. Palas depended on mercenary soldiers. This is a very interesting point, that apart from feudatory forces which were provided regularly by the Shamantas, the Pala army depended on mercenary soldiers. This was quite an interesting and a novel factor in contemporary early medieval Indian history. Navy also played an important part in the military system and for the progress of the Pala power. Now coming to the administration of the Pratiharas. First I'll talk about the model of kingship. In the history of the Gurjara Pratiharas, the king occupied the highest position in the state and enjoyed supreme power and prestige. He was adorned just like the Palas with such titles as Parameshwaro, Param Bhattarako and Maharajadhiraja. Here too a divine status was attached to the king in order to glorify his position and his existence. Especially the titles Parameshwaro and Param Bhattarako indicate this. Not only that, Nagabhatta I, the Gurjara Pratihara king, was imagined as Vishnu in his family records, and Bhoja I was described as Adi Baraho, a symbol of Lord Vishnu in the dynastic records. However, all the Pratihara monarchs did not claim this divinity status, and they projected themselves as rulers of the people. Technically, the Pratihara monarch was a symbol of omnipotence. He was the head of the administration, judiciary, army, and treasury. He could independently remove any officer from the highest position. At the same time, his authority was quite restrained too. A large part of the Pratihara empire was under the direct control of the feudatories and not the ruler. Here, the feudatories or the shamantas exerted power. It is true that the feudatories provided tributes as the main revenue of the state. They provided forces to the Pratihara military structure, and they assisted the king during the military campaigns, fighting under the monarch as well as under his officials, and they also attended the royal court as and when summoned. But in spite of all this, their status was quite important. The Pratihara monarchs had to maintain a good relationship with the feudatories because these shamantas represented pockets of autonomous power, and if they united, they could anytime weaken the control of the Pratihara monarch. Coming to the ministers and officials, there is again no mention of any Mantri Parishad or Council of Ministers in the Pratihara record. Here also we find a kind of a similarity with the Pala administrative structure. However, from the literary sources, we come across several names of posts and designations of different administrative functionaries. These names are as follows: the Kottapala, the highest officer of the fort; Tantrapala, the representative of the king in the Shamanta states; Dandapashika, the highest officer of the police department; Dando Nayako, who represented the military and the police department; Dutaka, who carried the orders and grant of the king to different persons concerned; then Bhangika, who wrote the orders of charities and grants; Bhavoharina, he was probably a legal advisor; Baladhikrat, or the chief of the army. And apart from all these posts, there were the mention of Mantri, Mahamantri, Sandhi Vigrahika, Bhandarika as high-ranking office bearers who assisted the king in the works of administration as well as in formulating the state policy. Coming to the provincial administrative structure of the Pratiharas. Here again also we find the similar demarcations like Bhukti, Mandala, Vishaya, and then the Gramo. The entire Pratihara state was divided into bhuktis or provinces. Pratihara inscriptions mention the name of such bhuktis as Kanokubjo, Sravasti, and Pratisthano. The king appointed the governor in each of the bhuktis, although the exact designation of the governor is not clearly mentioned in the records. Again, the governors of the bhuktis, they appointed assistants to help them in the work of administration, in the work of collection of revenues, and for the maintenance of law and order. Next to the bhuktis came the mandala. There were many mandalas in each bhukti. These were probably the district level administrations. Again, each mandala was comprised of a few vishayas. Vishaya was a lower administrative unit than the mandala. The inscriptions mention the name of certain vishayas as Udampur, Varanasi, Ashuradaka, and so on. The vishayas again, in turn, consisted of villages. Villages or gramas were the lowest administrative unit. Gramopati was in charge of the affairs of the villages. He was assisted in his work by the Mahattaras or the Mahattamos, who were the important citizens of the locality. Besides, we come across another group of officials who are known by the name of Panchakulo. These group of officials were connected with the administration of the towns and the cities. The Panchakulo is also known by some other names like Goshtha and Uttara Sabha. The main duty of these officials was to supervise the sales and purchase of commodities in the cities, to settle disputes, and to collect taxes. This reflected an efficient city administrative system and was also an important local unit. Now coming to the income and expenditure of the Pratiharas. Economy in the Pratihara Empire was largely based on agriculture. Therefore, the major source of government revenue was the tax collected from the bulk of agricultural produce. The feudal levies due from the subordinates of the Pratihara king was supplemented by the supply of garrisons on the frontier. Use of monetary economy is indicated. Apart from this, the Pratiharas also enjoyed trade relations with the outside world beyond the borders of the Indian subcontinent, and there was a considerable income from that source too. Expenditure of the Pratiharas involved maintenance of the royal household as well as taking care of the permanent army. On one end, the grandeur of the royal court and the royal household had to be taken care of, and on the other hand, the permanent army had to be maintained, and these two areas involved a lot of expenditure. Not only that, expenses had to be borne in cash when the soldiers of the army had to be paid. Gifts, grants, and construction works also involved regular disbursement of funds. Administrative structure of the Pratihara Empire proved to be quite efficient, which helped them in the maintenance of supremacy over a large area of the Indian subcontinent for a considerable period of time. Coming to the conclusion, one can say that both the Pala and the Pratihara rulers were sincere and efficient administrators. Their subjects lived in peace. These two royal houses built up welfare state with good governance and attempted to progress towards organized administrative machinery. However, both the Palas and the Pratiharas frequently fought with each other as well as with the Rashtrakutas, which resulted in the famous or most important political event of the contemporary period, the tripartite struggle. Finally, following historian Upinder Singh, one can argue that re-examination of the state system of early medieval India was important because it gave an idea about the political processes of the period. However, it should be kept in mind that apart from these structured and established kingdoms and empires, there was a large area. This large area consisted of forests where plough-based agriculture was absent, where caste society did not penetrate. So, while studying the importance of established political domain, one must also look beyond and examine these unexplored areas too. Thank you.